James Melendez, James All About Business. Today's topic is about Chief of Staff. This is an increasingly crucial role in organizations supporting leaders and leadership teams. This is a role I've completed, and I very much am passionate about this role and what it can do for any organizational type. Stay tuned. I'll give you my thoughts, perspectives, and experience on this role. A vital role, by no doubt. This is a role that you're seeing much more often today than you did, say, half a generation ago. You're seeing a considerable growth simply because leaders in leadership teams do not have the bandwidth, the capabilities of doing everything themselves. They definitely need a position like this to really anchor them, getting things done that are important for the organization to be doing. So if you're looking for a chief of staff, please continue to watch this content because I think you'll get some ideas and ways to build the optimum job description and seek out the right person for this very important role. A word cloud is important to highlight and frame a chief of staff. You're going to see words here or maybe phrases that are really reflecting maybe things that are important to your organization. Stop this video for a moment and take a look and read each of these because maybe there are things you're looking at in terms of how you're visioning your chief of staff for the future. Perhaps there's something you can vision from this by looking at these words and taking away what is important to your organization for your future chief of staff. Now, the definitions here are things I found online. I thought Wikipedia would have a really good, robust definition, and it did not. Merriam-Webster's did not either. These are really referring back to governmental or military chief of staff, which is a completely different focus. I looked for a real-world definition of chief of staff. The closest I could find is an article written by Julie DeWall in the publication Medium. She does say, and I'll just read a bit of this, a chief of staff is a right-hand person and force multiplier to an executive, and it's typically encompassing managing the executive's priorities, overseeing staff, internal operations, and spearheading special projects. While good, it is not great. It's also not realistic in terms of what a chief of staff does. So my expression is very different than this, and it's actually much more expansive. So mine's a very top-level definition. A modern chief of staff definition is what I call this. It's a professional who engages and supports leaders and leadership teams, completing routine and urgent assignments, projects and initiatives, gaining traction and realization of tactical and strategic elements. And I think to me this is really much more encompassing, but I did put some other words below this that are, I think, equally important in terms of what this person will do and can build to a job description. Now, this position additionally will do analysis, initiate projects, promotes innovation, increases communication. I won't read the rest, you can do that yourself, but I think to me this is really important to look at because this is honing in on the modern chief of staff role, and so these are things I've done myself and something that I think can build to your meaningful job description and your vision for a future chief of staff. Revolution has happened, I'd say slowly in some industries and very fast in other industries. So in the lower portion is practicality. The chief executive and the leadership team need this role because they cannot do everything. They cannot scribe everything. They cannot communicate everything. They don't have time to do a lot of things that maybe a chief executive did maybe half a generation to a generation ago. So for practical purposes, that's why this role has evolved and will continue to evolve, and more chief of staff will be needed in the future. Executional. A leader of an organization will ask for an executional piece to be done by the chief of staff. And this is something, while the executive may request that, or the leadership team, there's not enough bandwidth for them to observe it, monitor it, making sure it's being done. That is the role of the chief of staff. Modern organizations are more complex than they've ever been. So there's also a need for rapid turnaround in decisions, understanding the consequences as well as the unintended consequences in organizations. And so chief of staff roles have become much more charged with taking care of these things on behalf of executives and leadership teams. There are many more actions that need to be done to drive an organization today, to making sure that the organization is moving forward. So the leader and leadership team are charged with doing that. Action items are obviously more frequent, but also it's managing through making sure they're done and making sure there's accountability to each leader of that organization, making sure that they're following through on the actions they've committed to. Scorecarding is something I did, and this was something that was done on a bi-weekly basis, so the organization knew exactly where they stood in terms of making progress, or perhaps where they could lend support to making sure actions and perhaps getting to those goals much more quickly. So leadership team meetings, or sometimes they're called management team meetings, are something that the team would get together and meet, and this is where a lot of output would come. and that output wasn't actioned upon, or perhaps it wasn't memorialized or documented, that is decisions or actions, or perhaps specific endorsements, and so there was never a way of tracking towards that. So organizations would revisit decisions again and again, or perhaps maybe looking at particular aspects they've already looked at, and it's because there's not a framework to keep that moving forward. The chief of staff, the COS, I'll use both terms equally, COS and chief of staff, is essential in making sure there's traction, that the time points are being met. That is, that maybe there's a certain amount of time allocated for a specific discussion, or perhaps a decision is needed, and that particular COS will make sure that happens in that meeting time frame. They have a lot of decisions that they need to make, and meeting every other week sometimes doesn't accomplish that. And so I did have different strategies of how to accomplish that as well. But ultimately, this is a very, very important value add, and this is something that that chief of staff needs experience in doing, and even a methodology to implement this particular meeting facilitation and make sure there's quality to that facilitation. Documentation, again, this is something that the chief executive, the senior leader, and the leadership team doesn't have time to do. That's why I use Team Excellence. That's my documentation tool, and that's something to think about for your organization. So this is a very vital role for your organization and for the chief of staff to play. Analysis, this goes without saying. I did a lot of analysis that was given to me in terms of what needed to be done, but also understanding myself what was important to that organization. So becoming very close for half a decade with a particular set of leaders and understanding their analysis needs. Sometimes they didn't really tell you exactly what they needed, but I knew exactly what they needed, what was important at a certain point in time. To help the leadership team and leaders succeed is to look at the analysis and the data that comes through that they don't have time to do themselves. Special projects and initiatives, this is constant and ongoing. So communications is essential. While it may not be 80%, this is a huge portion of what you'll be doing. You may not be doing the communicating yourself, but you'll be a conduit making sure the communication is done. Maybe it's prompting a senior leader to write an email, or maybe it's a town hall that needs to happen that hasn't happened for a year or two. Coordination is really something that's a natural fit for this particular role, but it's something that, the chief executive and the leaders do not have time to do. And so you're really expected to making sure that all the loose ends are connected together and making sure that all the moving pieces are moving correctly. Chief of Staff, I think, has 10 pillars. I'll briefly go through this because I think these 10 pillars are essential. Now, when I look at a for-profit or non-profit Chief of Staff, there are things that this person needs to be doing that is strategic, tactical, facilitation. I just mentioned how important that is. Analytical, organizational development. I'll stop there for a moment because I really haven't talked about that. Organizational development, essential, because oftentimes there's a vision that the leadership team has for the organization to move forward, and that is developing that organization. It is a pivotal position for the COS, making sure that org development is happening and the results of that are paying benefits and moving the organization forward. Completely essential. Now the COS needs robust project management skills. Continuous improvement is something I think a lot of organizations, I hear it some of the time for some roles, but ultimately I think every COS needs to have a continuous improvement mindset and also the skill set to move that organization forward. Communication, I just mentioned, is essential to your organization, making sure that your organization is communicating to all its stakeholders in a timely and an effective manner. So leading the leader and leading the leadership team, this is what the COS has to do. They have to feel comfortable in that. And sometimes feeling comfortable is feeling uncomfortable. You need to press the leadership team to make decisions or to hold accountability. And there's different ways of doing that, of getting your leadership team to make those actions that are necessary to pivot that organization forward. And then lastly, relationship management. As a chief of staff, my experience was I was in constant development of relationship building. Very important to do to your organization, especially say for the individual contributors. They felt much more comfortable coming to me and giving their thoughts or maybe their questions on the senior leaders and what they were doing or what was the rationale behind something. But I also represented them anonymously, of course, in terms of the leadership team. I would let the LT know that here's what the organization pulse feels like today. Here's what people are thinking. Here are some questions people are having. And that is a success point for that organization because leaders are made aware. And those leaders can respond to those questions or concerns and making sure they have all the knowledge they need to be successful in their own individual roles and also for the chief executive officer. This will help the leader and the leadership team to be successful in making sure they're aware of the organization and the needs of that organization. Being a successful chief of staff is making sure you are positioning the leadership team for success for their individual contributor community as well. Designing the chief of staff role in this org chart is they are not on the same level of all, say, the C-suite, for example, and really they're on the support level. And so they're not exactly an EA, of course, but this is something where they are a support to the leader. The EA supports a leader in terms of specific needs for that leader. But ultimately, the COS is also in partnership with that leader and leadership team. And so it's really that responsibility and role. And also, that COS will work with the EA on specific matters. Maybe it's logistics for an offsite for the leadership team. I've also seen, organizations, and this is one I don't recommend, where the COS is really on the same level of all the direct reports of the leader. And to me, I think this is less successful because this particular position is, while they may be the facilitator and lead the meeting in terms of making sure it's happening and all the executional and deliverables are being met, it's also something where that COS does not have a team behind them. And sometimes there is a bit of resentment between the C-suite in terms of what that individual is doing and how they have many core responsibilities and have large teams, and the COS does not. And so sometimes it's a first amongst equals, which also doesn't fit well with the other members of the leadership team. So I think it's really important to bring them back to that position here. Now, I also think in terms of the future for designing a chief of staff role, I think this is a really healthy model because, again, the COS is responsive, is a support to the leader and leadership team, and I think it's in the right position. This is important to highlight because this person is not in a position of the C-suite necessarily, but they're really supporting that C-suite, but also they're supporting the community of chief of staffs. And here you see 6 of them. They represent each of the particular specializations. So maybe the chief marketing officer or the CIO. And all these individuals have their specific chief of staff. Now, I think this is important in terms of, say, communities of practice. Also making sure that a central methodology is driving this particular organization. And even each COS can cover for another COS if someone is out on leave. That each executive can have coverage of a COS on a constant basis. So this is important to think about. There's a large household technology corporation that has a model similar to this, and actually many of them do. In this particular company, I've observed that that company has radically different COS job descriptions. And in fact, I would say that that organization could not cover adequately if someone was out on an extended holiday or vacation or leave. This technology company has one of the largest market valuations, and yet it doesn't have a seamless organization of chief of staff. Well, each COS may not have the same specialty or may have the same duties exactly. They can definitely have some things that they can bring and help and support other COSs. Team excellence is a methodology in how organizations communicate, hold decisions, and also really making sure that the priorities of that organization are held together in one location. So every single COS is not going to do the same exact thing because each operation, each specific function will have different requirements. But I think ultimately a success is when that can work together in terms of community practice and also for having each COS being able to cover for any other COS when they are on extended leave. So when you're thinking of designing a chief of staff role, think about doing the following things. Focus on needs of the leader and leadership team and organization equally. Root out extraneous duties that should be delegated to other roles. Finance manager, executive assistant, data scientist, etc. Select a chief of staff that can guide and teach because that's about facilitation. It's about communities of practice, but it's also ways of helping the organization in ways that you might not expect, but you could use in the future. Experience need apply, and I think it's really important. Sometimes they're overly specialized. I've seen things where a chief of staff is required to have a PhD or an MD or other specialized degree. Perhaps they need to be coming from an investment bank background, or even they need to have a management consultant background. I was a chief of staff in a biotechnology organization. I don't have a biotechnology degree, and I was able to successfully do this role for half a decade. You should be very specific about what you need, but also not overly specific on technical requirements. Why do you need an investment banking professional, or why do you need a professional from a management consultant background? And I would say those individuals, while they can be very bright, can also be individuals who don't have experience in an operating company. Select somebody with experience working in an operating company. There are very few people, qualified people, to do this job. Also, do not expect only Ivy League apply. So when you look at, say, a position and it asks for education, sometimes they'll even say, do you have an Ivy League education? Don't box yourself in with overly specialized requirements. And I think this is one where you could have a very well educated, very smart individual, very intelligent individual take this role who did not go to an Ivy League school. So look carefully for what you want. Also know your pool is very small. Definitely seek out experience. So success is by plan, not by accident. An experienced COS can help the leader and leadership team achieve tangible results. Action, making sure that there's an increased action completion, demonstrating commitment, accountability, and movement in your organization. Communication, I've touched upon that already, but it's an essential part of any chief of staff role. So the COS role is making sure goals and strategy are, being achieved. It is a role of the chief of staff making sure that they are the conduit of success to that leadership team. And lastly, building high-performance organizations is not just hiring somebody, say, from a specific degree category or perhaps a specific university. It's really making sure that the organization is mapping, creating a roadmap of what that high performance looks like, and the chief of staff can be pivotal in making sure your organization is getting there, helping the leader and leadership team actualize this particular part of high performance. And I think this is really something that is completely essential. It's not just a value add, it is a must-have as a chief of staff to think about your objectives and making sure that that particular role is meeting that particular need for that organization. Let me know how I can help your organization. Perhaps you're thinking about striking out and creating your first chief of staff role. Or perhaps you want me to examine how your chief of staff can be optimized to really meet the needs of your organization. Contact me. Let me know how I can help you. And also be sure to subscribe to this channel, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching today. I do appreciate it.